Hello, dear viewers of the Fear Files channel. Today, we're diving into one of the creepiest yet fascinating stories of the Victorian era. A story that made people wake up at night in a cold sweat. A story about the fear of being buried alive. This is a story about the bells of the dead, about coffins with ropes that stretch to the surface of the earth, about special safety devices that were supposed to save a person from the most terrible nightmare imaginable. Sit back, turn off the lights, and let's begin this grim journey into the past. The Victorian era, spanning much of the 19th century, was a time of incredible contrasts. On the one hand, it was an era of progress, the Industrial Revolution, scientific discoveries, and technological advances. On the other hand, it was a time when death was everywhere, when people were dying from diseases that are easily treated with antibiotics today, when infant mortality was frighteningly high and life expectancy was much shorter than it is now. Death was not an abstract concept, but a constant companion of life. People got used to her presence, but at the same time, they were afraid of her in a way that we rarely fear today. Among all the fears associated with death, one stood out most prominently: the fear of being buried alive. This fear had very real grounds. 19th century medicine was still far from perfect. Doctors have not always been able to determine for sure whether a person has actually died or is simply in a state of deep coma, lethargic sleep, or catalepsy. There were no reliable methods for diagnosing death, such as an electrocardiogram or an electroencephalogram. Doctors relied on simple signs such as no breathing, no pulse, no pupils reacting to light. But all these signs could be deceptive. Lethargic sleep, catalepsy, coma, deep syncope. All these conditions could simulate death so convincingly that even experienced doctors could make a mistake. A person could lie motionless, with barely noticeable breathing and a pulse so weak that it was impossible to feel it without special instruments. And in such a situation, especially if the family wanted to bury the deceased as soon as possible because of the heat or for religious reasons, the person could be declared dead and sent to a coffin. Victorian newspapers were full of stories of people being dug up alive or showing signs that they were trying to get out of the coffin after burial. These stories were passed from mouth to mouth, overgrown with new terrible details. They talked about scratches on the inside of the coffin lid, about torn shrouds, about bodies that were found in unnatural poses, clearly indicating death agony. It is difficult to say how much these stories were true and how much were the fruit of collective paranoia. But the fact remains that people were afraid of a live burial so much that it became a real phobia called taphophobia. This fear was not unfounded. There were indeed documented cases of people being buried alive. One of the most famous stories occurred in the 17th century and concerned Marjorie Elphinstone, a Scottish noblewoman. She was buried in the family crypt, but that night the gravediggers decided to return to steal the jewels she was wearing. When they tried to remove the ring from her finger, the woman suddenly woke up and screamed. The robbers fled in terror, and Marjorie was able to return home, where she lived for many more years. This story has become legendary and has been passed down from generation to generation, increasing the fear of a live burial. Another famous case is associated with the name of Cardinal Donny, who lived in the 18th century. He was buried with great fanfare, but a few years later, when the crypt was opened for the burial of another family member, it was found that his body was at the door of the crypt and his hands were disfigured. Apparently, he was trying to get out. This incident made a great impression on contemporaries and became another proof that a live burial is not just an invention, but a very real danger. In the 19th century, with the development of the press, such stories began to be published regularly. Newspapers willingly printed heartbreaking stories about people who were buried alive. Some of these stories were true, others were exaggerated or completely invented, but they all added fuel to the fire of public paranoia. People began to demand some guarantees, some ways to protect themselves from this terrible outcome. Inventors and entrepreneurs quickly picked up on the mood of the public and began to come up with various solutions. This is how the so-called safety coffins or rescue coffins appeared. These were specially designed coffins, equipped with various mechanisms that were supposed to allow a person, if he suddenly woke up after burial, to give a signal to the surface or even get out of the grave on his own. The most common and famous of these mechanisms was the bell of the dead. The design was relatively simple, but it seemed ingenious. A rope or chain was tied to the hand or finger of the buried, which passed through a special hole in the lid of the coffin and then through a pipe or shaft dug together with the grave, came to the surface of the earth. On the surface, this rope was connected to a bell, which was installed on a special pillar or frame above the grave. The idea was that if a person woke up in a coffin, he would be able to pull the rope, the bell would ring, and the cemetery keeper or passersby would hear the signal and come to the rescue. Some more elaborate models included not only a bell, but also a flag that was hoisted when a rope was pulled to attract attention during the daytime, when the sound of the bell might not be as noticeable. There were also designs that included air tubes through which fresh air entered the coffin so that a person would not suffocate while waiting for rescue. Some inventors went even further and offered coffins with ladders, with locks that could be opened from the inside, with spring lids that opened when a special lever was pressed. One of the most famous inventors of such devices was the German doctor Adolf Gutsmuts, who patented several models of rescue coffins in the mid-19th century. Its designs were quite complex and included bells, flags, air pipes, and even a lock system. Gutsmuts actively promoted his inventions, claiming that they could save hundreds of lives. He published pamphlets, gave interviews to newspapers, and even organized public demonstrations of his coffins. Another famous inventor, Count Michel de Carnice of Belgium, developed his own system. His coffin was equipped with a glass tube that went from the face of the buried to the surface. Through this tube, a person could breathe, as well as give a signal by voice or whistle. In addition, a lamp was built into the system, which was lit when the rope was pulled, so that at night you could see that help was needed in the cemetery. There were also more bizarre inventions. For example, one American inventor proposed a coffin with a telephone that was connected to the watchman's booth. A person who woke up in a coffin could simply pick up the phone and call for help. However, such a system required electricity in the cemetery and regular maintenance, which made it extremely impractical and expensive. Despite the seeming practicality of these inventions, they had many drawbacks. Firstly, they were expensive. Only wealthy people could afford a rescue coffin. Ordinary workers and peasants continued to bury their dead in ordinary wooden coffins without any devices. Second, these systems were unreliable. Ropes could rot in the damp ground, bells could rust and stop ringing, pipes could get clogged with dirt. In addition, if a person did wake up in a coffin, he could be so weak or disoriented that he would not be able to use the mechanism of salvation. There was another problem: false alarms. The fact is that the process of decomposition of the body is accompanied by the release of gases that can cause movements of the limbs. Muscles can contract, the body can change position, and these movements can pull the rope and activate the bell. Cemetery guards complained that the bells often rang at night, but when they dug up graves, they found only decomposing corpses, not living people in need of rescue. Nevertheless, rescue coffins were in some demand. They were advertised in newspapers, sold in specialized stores, and demonstrated at exhibitions. The fear of a live burial was so strong that people were ready to pay a lot of money for at least a faint hope of salvation. Wealthy Victorians included special clauses in their wills requiring the use of rescue coffins or other precautions against live burial. Interestingly, this paranoia affected not only ordinary people, but also many famous personalities of that time. For example, the famous writer Edgar Allan Poe was so obsessed with the fear of a living burial that he devoted several of his stories to this topic, including a terrifying novel called Buried Alive. In this story, he describes in detail the horror of a man who woke up in the absolute darkness of the coffin, realized where he was, and realized that he was doomed to a slow and painful death from suffocation. Poe was not alone in his fears. Many Victorians left in their wills what we now think are strange dispositions. They asked to have their veins slit after death to make sure they were dead. Some demanded that their bodies be kept unburied for several days so that decomposition would become apparent. There were also those who asked to cut off their heads or pierce their hearts before burial, gloomy, but from their point of view, necessary precautions. Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, for example, bequeathed the construction of a special mausoleum over his grave with a window through which his body could be observed. He also insisted that a hole be made in the lid of his coffin, connected to a pipe coming to the surface. In addition, he had a rope in his hand connected to a bell. The Duke wanted to be absolutely sure that if he suddenly woke up, he would be able to give a signal. The famous English aristocrat Lady Mary Coke bequeathed a huge sum of money to the doctor who would monitor her body for a week after her death and would be able to testify that she was indeed dead. Her body was kept in a special room where a doctor was on duty around the clock, checking for signs of life. It wasn't until the obvious decay began that Lady Mary was finally buried. Victorian cemeteries were strange places. At night, over the graves equipped with rescue systems, you could see the silhouettes of watchmen who walked between the tombstones, listening to the ringing of bells. This work was nervous and exhausting. The watchmen had to work in the dark, in the silence of the cemetery, surrounded by graves and gloomy thoughts. Every sound, every rustle could seem like the ringing of a rescue bell. The wind swaying the trees, the animals digging in the ground, the simple echo. All this created an atmosphere of constant tension. It is said that it was from this practice that the expression working on the cemetery shift or night shift originated, as well as the phrase saved by the bell, which originally could refer not to boxing, but to saving from a live burial. Although linguists debate the origin of these expressions, the connection to Victorian cemetery practices seems quite logical. But were there any real cases when these bells really saved people? There is surprisingly little documentary evidence. There are many stories and legends, but most of them cannot be verified. Some historians believe that there was not a single reliably confirmed case when a rescue coffin actually saved a life. Others point to a few cases described in newspapers of the time, although these descriptions may be exaggerations or entirely made-up stories designed to increase newspaper sales. One such story tells of a young woman from Paris who was buried after falling into a deep coma. Her coffin was equipped with a bell, and on the second night after the funeral, the watchman heard its ringing. The grave was opened, and the woman was found alive, although in an extremely weak condition. She was rescued, and she lived for many more years. The story has been widely reported in the press and used by rescue coffin manufacturers for promotional purposes, but many details are questionable, and some researchers consider it entirely fictional. With the development of medicine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the situation began to change. Doctors have received more reliable methods for diagnosing death. Stethoscopes appeared, which made it possible to check the work of the heart more accurately. Tests were developed based on a body's response to various stimuli. Procedures for declaring death have become stricter and more formalized. Most countries have passed laws requiring the body to be examined by a qualified doctor before a death certificate can be issued. In addition, funeral practices have also changed. Bodies began to be embalmed, which made live burial almost impossible. The embalming process itself is fatal for a living person. Morgues appeared, where bodies were kept for a certain time before burial, which gave an additional guarantee that the person was really dead. Gradually, the fear of a living burial began to fade. By the beginning of the 20th century, rescue coffins had fallen out of fashion. Their production had ceased, and they had become only a curious historical artifact, a reminder of the strange fears of the Victorian era. Cemeteries stopped hiring special watchmen to listen to the bells, and the bells over the graves gradually disappeared. However, the fear of a living burial did not disappear completely. Even today, there is taphophobia, the clinical fear of being buried alive. Some people still include in their wills requirements for embalming, cremation, or other measures that ensure they are not buried alive. True, modern medicine makes the probability of erroneously declaring death extremely low, although not zero. Interestingly, in the 21st century, there have been several cases in which people who were declared dead turn out to be alive. In 2014 in the United States, a woman woke up in a morgue a few hours before the planned autopsy. In 2018 in India, a man regained consciousness right before cremation. These cases are extremely rare and usually occur in settings where medical care was inadequately qualified or when the person was in a very unusual condition that mimicked death. But let's go back to the Victorian era and its strange obsession with living burial. Why did this fear reach such proportions at this time? Historians and psychologists offer several explanations. Firstly, it was an era of great epidemics. Cholera, typhus, smallpox, tuberculosis claimed thousands of lives. Diseases spread rapidly. People died en masse. And in such a situation, doctors simply did not have time to carefully check each body. Mistakes were inevitable. Secondly, the Victorian era was a time of Romanticism and Gothic. The literature of that time was full of dark stories about ghosts, vampires, and premature burials. Edgar Allan Poe, Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, and other writers created an atmosphere of dark horror that influenced public consciousness. People read these stories, and the line between fiction and reality began to blur. Third, death in the Victorian era was more visible than it is now. People were buried quickly, often right in the courtyard of the house or in the family crypt. There were no modern funeral homes that take care of the body. The family themselves prepared the deceased for the funeral, washed the body itself, dressed it, put it in the coffin. This nearness to death made her more real and frightening. Finally, the Victorians were obsessed with death in general. There was a whole cult of mourning, especially after the death of Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. The Queen wore mourning for the rest of her life, and this set the tone for the entire society. Mourning clothes, mourning decorations, posthumous photographs where the dead were photographed as if they were asleep or even standing. All this was part of Victorian culture. The posthumous photograph deserves special mention. This was a widespread practice, especially when it came to children. The parents wanted to keep at least the image of their deceased child, and the photographer came to take the last portrait. The deceased was seated or laid down in a natural position, sometimes next to living family members, and a photograph was taken. Today, these images look creepy and out of place. But for the Victorians, it was a way to preserve the memory of a loved one. All of these factors together created an atmosphere in which the fear of a living burial could flourish. It was a fear fueled by real-life cases of medical errors, horror literature, nearness to death, and a general obsession with dark themes. In such an atmosphere, the invention of life-saving coffins with bells seemed not only reasonable, but absolutely necessary. Today, we look at these inventions with curiosity and mild horror. They seem strange to us, almost absurd. But for the people of that time, it was an attempt to gain at least some control over the uncontrollable, an attempt to protect themselves from the terror that haunted their imagination. The bells of the dead were a symbol of hope, however desperate, that even from the grave there was a way out, that death could be cheated if it came too early. Interestingly, the theme of living burial continues to excite the human imagination today. Horror films regularly address this theme. Movies like Ryan Reynolds' Buried Alive, where the protagonist wakes up in a coffin underground, exploit this primal fear. TV shows and books also continue to explore this topic, showing that the fear of a living burial is rooted somewhere deep in our subconscious. This fear is probably related to deeper phobias: claustrophobia, fear of the dark, fear of helplessness, and uncontrollability of the situation. To be buried alive means to be in a confined space, in complete darkness, without the ability to move, scream for help, or escape. This is the quintessence of helplessness, a complete loss of control over one's fate. No wonder this fear is so strong and universal. The Victorian rescue coffins were an attempt to regain at least the illusion of control. The rope in the hand, connected to the bell at the top, was a thin thread connecting the buried with the world of the living. It was an opportunity to call for help, an opportunity to be heard. Even if this possibility was illusory and almost never put into practice, its very existence brought comfort. Today, we can smile at the strange inventions of the past, but it is worth remembering that they were born out of real fears and real problems. Medicine was indeed imperfect, mistakes did happen, and some people could indeed be buried prematurely. The rescue coffins were a response to a real, if exaggerated, danger. By the way, similar fears existed not only in Europe and America. Different cultures around the world have had their own ways of dealing with the fear of premature burial. In some traditional societies, bodies were kept unburied for long periods of time, sometimes weeks or even months, to make sure that the person was really dead. In other cultures, there were rituals designed to kill a person completely before burial. For example, symbolic piercing of the heart or cutting veins. In ancient Rome, there was a custom to loudly call out the name of the deceased several times before closing the coffin. If a person did not respond after a few calls, it was believed that he was really dead. In some European countries, it was common practice to leave food and drink near the body for a few days. If the food remained untouched, it served as further proof of death. But it was the Victorian era that brought concern for the prevention of living burial to the level of a real industry. Dozens of inventors patented their designs of rescue coffins. Manufacturers competed with each other, offering more and more complex and supposedly reliable systems. Advertising of these inventions was everywhere, in newspapers, magazines, at exhibitions. It was a real business built on human fear. There were even special exhibitions and demonstrations where inventors showed how their systems worked. The actor was placed in a coffin, buried at a shallow depth, and then he demonstrated how he could give a signal with the help of a bell or flag. The public looked on with horror and admiration, and sales of rescue coffins grew. Even the catalogs of funeral homes of that time have been preserved, where rescue coffins were offered on a par with ordinary ones at a higher price. Of course, the catalogs described in detail all the advantages of these designs, cited the testimonies of satisfied customers, or rather their relatives, who slept more peacefully, knowing that their deceased was equipped with a means of communication with the world of the living. Gradually, the fear began to subside. There were several reasons. First, medicine was becoming more and more reliable. Secondly, there were more cases of false alarms, where bells rang due to natural decomposition processes or animals rummaging through the cemetery, rather than because someone really needed help. Thirdly, society itself began to change. The beginning of the 20th century brought with it new fears and new problems. World wars, economic crises, and the rapid development of technology have pushed the fear of living burial into the background. People have other, more pressing reasons for concern. Death was still frightening, but now it was feared in the form of gas attacks, bombings, flu epidemics, and not in the form of premature burial. In addition, the funeral practices themselves have changed. Cremation became increasingly popular, especially in Europe. For many, this was the ultimate solution to the problem of living burial. You can't wake up in a coffin if your body is turned to ashes. Of course, opponents of cremation pointed out that being burned alive is even worse than being buried alive, but supporters rightly pointed out that the high temperature of the crematorium will kill even a comatose person in a matter of seconds, while in a coffin underground you can suffer for hours. Interestingly, it was the fear of a live burial that became one of the arguments in favor of cremation when this practice was just beginning to spread in Christian countries. Prior to this, cremation was considered a pagan practice and was forbidden by the church. But at the end of the 19th century, when the debate about the legalization of cremation began, one of the main arguments was precisely protection from living burial. If a person is cremated, said the proponents of the practice, there can be no doubt that he is really dead. The church resisted for a long time, but in the end it was forced to give in. The first crematoriums began to appear in European cities at the end of the 19th century. By the mid-20th century, cremation had become a common practice, although traditional burial is still more popular in some countries and regions. What happened to the rescue coffins? Most of them simply rotted in the ground along with those they were supposed to protect. Some specimens have survived in museums as curious artifacts from the Victorian era. They can be seen in museums of the history of medicine, in collections dedicated to funeral practices, in exhibitions about Victorian culture. They are standing there behind the glass, these strange coffins with tubes and ropes, silent witnesses of an era when the fear of death took very concrete and material forms. Some modern enthusiasts even recreate such coffins for exhibitions and educational programs. On Halloween, some museums have special tours where visitors are told about the fear of a live burial and shown how rescue systems worked. It has become part of popular culture, a way to safely tickle your nerves by experiencing the real horrors of the past. It must be said that not all rescue devices were associated with bells. There were other, sometimes even more bizarre inventions. For example, one French inventor proposed a coffin with a hatch in the lid, which could be opened from the inside using a special lever. The problem was that after the burial, earth was poured onto the coffin, which pressed on the lid with such force that it was physically impossible to open the hatch from the inside. The inventor tried to solve this problem by proposing to install a special protective box over the coffin, which would take the weight of the earth, but this made the whole structure even more expensive and complex. Another inventor proposed a coffin with a spring mechanism that threw the lid up if a person pressed the pedal with his feet. It sounds impressive, but in practice, the mechanism often worked spontaneously due to the pressure of gases produced during decomposition, leading to eerie scenes in the cemetery when the lid of the coffin suddenly jumped up, scaring the hell out of visitors. There was even a project of an elevator coffin, which, when activated, was supposed to rise to the surface along the guides. This structure required serious engineering work at each burial and cost a fortune, so it was practically not used. Only a few descriptions of such coffins have survived, and it is not known whether they were ever actually installed or remained only on paper in patent offices. Interestingly, the fear of a live burial has even affected the military sphere. During the First World War, when soldiers died by the thousands and the medical service was overwhelmed, fears of premature burial increased manifold. Soldiers were buried quickly, often right on the battlefield, without a thorough examination. There were orders to check the pulse and breathing, but in combat conditions this was not always observed. There are reports of cases when the wounded, who fell into a deep coma or shock, were mistaken for the dead and placed in mass graves. Some of them regained consciousness after they began to throw earth on them. These stories, the truth of which is difficult to verify, circulated among the soldiers and increased the already high levels of stress and fear. After the war, some countries adopted stricter rules for identifying the dead and ascertaining death. Medical protocols have become more detailed. There is a requirement for a mandatory examination of the body by a qualified doctor, even in the field. This was one of the lessons that humanity learned from the horrors of the World War. But let's get back to our main topic, the bells of the dead. Why did the bell become the most popular means of communication between the buried and the outside world? The answer is simple. The bell was a reliable, understandable, and effective device. Its ringing could be heard at a considerable distance. It did not require complex maintenance, and it was easy to install. The rope from the hand of the buried to the bell on the surface was a simple and at the same time ingenious idea. The bells also had a symbolic meaning. In the Christian tradition, bells were associated with the church, with the call to prayer, with important life events, birth, wedding, death. The ringing of the bell in the cemetery was a familiar sound. The use of the bell as a rescue signal seemed to be a natural continuation of this tradition. In some cemeteries, there were special chapels or booths for guards, where people trained to respond to the ringing of bells were on duty around the clock. They had tools for quickly digging up graves, shovels, pickaxes, sometimes even special jacks that were supposed to help lift the lid of the coffin without digging it up completely. Theoretically, the system was supposed to work like this. The bell rings, the watchman determines which grave is over, runs there with tools, quickly digs up the coffin, opens the lid, and saves the person. In practice, everything was more complicated. Firstly, it is very dark at night in the cemetery, and it was not easy to determine the source of the sound. Secondly, digging a grave, even working very quickly, is a matter of hours, not minutes. Thirdly, a person who wakes up in a coffin underground is likely to be in a panic, possibly getting injured or having a heart attack. Fourth, as we have already said, most of the bells have been false alarms caused by natural processes. Still, the idea that help could come, that you weren't alone in your nightmare, had tremendous psychological implications. People wanted to believe that even from the grave there was a way back, that death could be cheated if it came by mistake. It is curious that the theme of rescue coffins and bells of the dead was reflected not only in horror literature, but also in humorous works. Some satirists satirized this obsession by creating comic stories about bells ringing for the most ridiculous reasons, or about enterprising inventors who profited from human fear. Mark Twain, for example, wrote several humorous notes about the strange funeral practices of his time, although he did not devote a separate work specifically to rescue coffins. There were also scammers who profited from this fear. They sold fake or low-quality rescue coffins that could not perform their function. Some offered security installation services for a lot of money, which were actually useless. The legislation of that time practically did not regulate this area, so fraudsters acted with impunity. Gradually, with the improvement of medical knowledge and practices, the need for such devices disappeared. By the middle of the 20th century, the production of rescue coffins had practically ceased. The last patents for such devices date back to about the 1940s and 50s, and these were more curiosities than serious commercial proposals. Modern medicine has many ways to accurately determine death. In addition to traditional signs, such as the absence of pulse and breathing, electrocardiograms are used to record the electrical activity of the heart, encephalograms that show brain activity, and various reflex tests. In case of doubt, the body is observed for a certain time before declaring the person dead. The probability of error in modern conditions is extremely small, although, as we have already mentioned, incidents occasionally occur, especially in countries with less developed health systems. Nevertheless, the fear remains. Taphophobia is a real disorder that some people suffer from. They have an obsessive fear of being buried alive, and this fear can seriously affect their quality of life. Some refuse to attend funerals, cannot be in confined spaces, suffer from nightmares in which they see themselves in a coffin underground. A variety of psychotherapies are used to treat this phobia, including cognitive behavioral therapy and gradual desensitization. Interestingly, some modern cultures still have traditions related to protection against premature burial. In some regions of Eastern Europe, for example, it is still customary to leave the body unburied for 3 days, regardless of the medical report of death. This is due both to religious beliefs that the soul leaves the body gradually and to the residual fear of a living burial. In some modern coffins, you can still find elements reminiscent of Victorian rescue systems. For example, there are coffins with battery-powered internal lighting that turns on when the lid is opened, or with ventilation holes, although their function is more symbolic than practical. There are even companies that offer to install a mobile phone in the coffin in case a person wakes up, although this is more of a marketing ploy than a serious offer. One company in the US has even created a modern version of a life-saving coffin, equipped with motion, heartbeat, and temperature sensors that are connected to an alert system via satellite communication. If the sensors register signs of life, the system automatically sends a signal to the rescue service. Such a coffin costs tens of thousands of dollars, and it is not known whether it was ever actually used, But the very fact of its existence shows that the topic of a live burial is still relevant for some people. The fear of a living burial also touches on broader philosophical questions about the nature of death, about the boundary between life and death, about what it means to be alive. In the Victorian era, these questions were especially acute because medicine was just beginning to understand the processes that occur in the body at death. Today we know much more, but some mysteries remain. What happens to consciousness at the moment of death? Can a person be aware of what is happening around him if his brain is not yet completely dead, but the body is no longer functioning? These questions continue to worry scientists, philosophers, and ordinary people. There are testimonies of people who have survived clinical death who say that they heard and were aware of what was happening around them, even when they were thought to be dead. Doctors and nurses discussed their condition, relatives said goodbye to them, and they heard all this, but could not give a sign that they were still alive. These stories, of course, refer to situations in hospitals where a person was eventually resuscitated rather than buried. But they show how complex and ambiguous the line between life and death is. The modern definition of death is based on the concept of brain death. A person is considered dead when his brain irreversibly stops functioning, even if the heart can still be made to beat with the help of equipment. This definition is accepted in most countries and avoids situations where a person can be pronounced dead prematurely. However, there are also difficulties and ethical dilemmas, especially when it comes to organ donation or shutting down life support systems. The Victorians did not have all this knowledge and technology. For them, death was more mysterious and unpredictable. They lived in a world where disease could kill in a few days, where there were no antibiotics, where surgery was extremely dangerous due to the lack of antiseptics and anesthesia. In such a world, the fear of death, and especially of a live burial, was not just a phobia, but a rational reaction to real danger. The bells of the dead were an attempt to deal with this danger, an attempt to create a system of security in an unpredictable world. They weren't the perfect solution, and they may never have saved a single life, but they gave people what they desperately needed: hope. The hope is that if the worst happens, if they're buried by mistake, they will have a chance, there will be a way to call for help, there will be someone who will hear them. Today, these bells are silent. The cemeteries where they once rang are long gone, or have been turned into historical monuments. Graves with ropes stretching to the surface have long been abandoned and forgotten. But the story of the bells of the dead reminds us of how people of the past coped with their fears, how they tried to gain control over the uncontrollable, how they hoped to cheat death itself. This story also reminds us of how important the progress of medicine is. What was a real and frightening danger to the Victorians has become to us only a curious historical fact. We live in a world where the probability of being buried alive is negligible, where death is diagnosed with high accuracy, where even if there is an error, verification systems are likely to detect it. This is a huge achievement that we often take for granted. But the history of the bells of the dead is not only the history of progress. It is also a story about how fear can shape culture, how it can create entire industries, how it can affect art, literature, or customs. The fear of a live burial gave rise not only to rescue coffins, but also to a whole layer of horror literature, changed funeral practices, and influenced the development of medicine. In Victorian literature, the theme of living burial occurs again and again. In addition to the already mentioned Edgar Allan Poe, other writers also turn to her. Wilkie Collins in her novel, The Woman in White, uses the motif of replacing the deceased with a living person in the grave. Charles Dickens also touches on the theme of premature burial in some of his works. This theme was so popular that it became almost an indispensable element of Gothic literature of that time. Interestingly, in parallel with the fear of a living burial in the Victorian era, there was also the opposite fear, the fear of the dead who might rise from their graves. It was the heyday of vampire stories, zombies, the living dead. Dracula by Bram Stoker, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, numerous ghost stories. All this reflected the contradictory attitude of the Victorians to death. On the one hand, they were afraid of being buried alive. On the other hand, they were afraid that the dead would rise. These two fears, seemingly contradictory, actually had a common root: uncertainty about where the line between life and death lies. The Victorians lived in an era of transition, when old religious ideas about death and the afterlife were beginning to erode under the onslaught of the scientific worldview, but science could not yet provide definitive answers to all questions. In this uncertainty, fears and superstitions blossomed. The bells of the dead were the materialization of these fears, an attempt to find a practical solution to a metaphysical problem. They were a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, a symbol that this border is permeable, that can be crossed in both directions. A person could return from death if he was presumed dead by mistake. This was the idea behind these inventions. Today we look at all this from the height of our time, with the baggage of our knowledge, and it is easy to judge how irrational these fears were. But it is worth remembering that each era has its own fears, its own phobias, its own ways of dealing with the unknown. Perhaps 100 years from now, people of the future will be perplexed by our fears and the ways in which we try to deal with them. However, some things remain unchanged. The fear of death, the fear of losing control, the fear of being in a situation of complete helplessness. These fears are universal and eternal. They take different forms in different eras, but their essence remains the same. The bells of the dead were just one way to deal with these eternal fears, a way that seems bizarre and even funny to us today, but which for the people of that time was quite serious and important. The history of Victorian life coffins is also a history of entrepreneurship and innovation. The inventors of those times were ready to experiment, offer the most incredible solutions, and patent their ideas. Some of them probably sincerely wanted to help people, to save lives. Others simply saw a profitable niche in the market and tried to fill it. One way or another, this industry has existed for several decades and left its mark on history. Today, when we visit old Victorian cemeteries, we can sometimes see traces of this era. Rusted bells on rickety pillars, dilapidated pipes sticking out of the ground. Strange metal structures over ancient graves are all silent witnesses to a time when people were so desperately afraid of death that they tried to create a way back even from the ground. These artifacts remind us of the fragility of human life, how far we have come in understanding death, and how much remains unknown. They make us think about our own fears, about what will frighten people in 100 or 200 years, what stories from our time will seem strange and bizarre to them. The Victorian era ended more than a century ago. The bells of the dead have long ceased to ring. The last watchman who listened to their ringing in the night silence of the cemetery died many decades ago. Rescue coffins rotted into the ground or turned into museum exhibits. But the memory of this strange time, of this collective fear, of these desperate attempts to cheat death, this memory remains. It remains in the literature we read. When we open the stories of Edgar Allan Poe and shudder at the description of the horror of a man who wakes up in a coffin, we touch the same fear that haunted the Victorians. It remains in horror films, which again and again address the theme of living burial, exploiting this ancient, primal fear. It remains in our own nightmares, in claustrophobia, in panic attacks, in irrational fear of confined spaces. The history of the bells of the dead also teaches us humility in the face of the unknown. The Victorians, with their faith in progress and science, with their industrial revolution and technological advances, were still defenseless against the fundamental mystery of existence, the mystery of death. Their life-saving coffins were an admission of this defenselessness, an attempt to find a solution where perhaps there is no solution. We, the people of the 21st century, have incomparably better knowledge and technology. We can keep the body alive when the brain is already dead. We can freeze bodies in the hope of resurrection in the future. We can transplant organs, create artificial body parts, edit genes. But can we say that we have completely conquered the fear of death? Of course not. We've just found other ways to deal with it, other illusions of control that help us live without constantly thinking about the inevitable end. Perhaps in 100 years, our attempts to defeat death, cryonics, uploading consciousness to a computer, radically extending life, will seem as naive and touching as the bells of the dead seem to us now. But this does not make them less important, less significant for us here and now. The bells of the dead no longer ring in Victorian cemeteries. The ropes decayed, the mechanisms rusted, the graves overgrown with grass and moss. But the memory of them lives on, reminding us of a time when people were so afraid of death that they were willing to stretch a rope out of the grave in the hope that someone would hear their call for help. It was a story of fear and hope, of progress and superstition, of the boundary between life and death, which has always been and remains the most mysterious frontier of human existence. It was a story about how people tried to maintain control even in the face of absolute inevitability. And in the end, it was a story about human nature itself, about our refusal to humble ourselves, about our desire to fight to the end, about our hope that does not die even in the darkest circumstances. Thank you for being with us today on the Fear Files channel. We have plunged into one of the darkest chapters of human history, touched the fears of our ancestors, and perhaps understood our own fears a little better. Remember, what seems obvious to us today was an incomprehensible mystery yesterday, and what we don't understand now will become the simple truth tomorrow. But some things remain the same: our mortality, our fears, and our eternal hope of finding a way to overcome them. See you in the next issue. Good night, if you can fall asleep after this story.